Hey everyone, this is Jim, and I'm going to do a demonstration on App Machine's mobile development kit, specifically on their JavaScript API. I have done two other demos thus far, one of them on web service calls on how to retrieve data and how to save data, and another one on screens and lists. As I've stated in other demonstrations, the application that I have to create is interactive and is data driven. So depending on the data that's coming back from a web service call, I may want to show certain screens, or I may want to disable certain components. And the basic building blocks that App Machine has aren't designed to handle that kind of request. To solve that problem, App Machine has put together and allowed you to use JavaScript, and the JavaScript components are very powerful, and if you're familiar with JavaScript, hopefully very easy to use. So I'm going to go over how to use this thing and just show you a little bit about it, but for the most part, if you know JavaScript, then that's really all you need to know, and then I'll show you how to incorporate it. So let's get started. So to get started, what we're going to do here is we are going to show you, or I'm going to show you how to add a JavaScript block, and I'll go over a little bit about what it looks like once you do that. So to create a JavaScript block, you go to Block, you go to Pro, you go to JavaScript. We're going to add the block, and I'll call it, just for now, Testing, just so that you can see what this thing looks like. Now you can see it's a JavaScript block up here. And what we have is, when you go into Editor, the tabs are a little different than any of the other blocks, but you'll have an editor. And in there you'll notice there are two files that are of interest, and then you've got some documentation. You have the index.html, we'll take a look at that. That looks like just any other HTML file that you would have on a web page. So if you're familiar with HTML, this looks very familiar to you. And what we have in here is we have App Machine modules. You want to keep this stuff. This allows you to access some of the App Machine components that we'll talk about a little later on. And then you've got a body, and in there you could put whatever you want, any HTML that you want. If you have a web page that you already have, you could literally paste the whole web page in here and access it through the JavaScript like you would just any other JavaScript function calls. So this should look fairly familiar, and again, it's pretty stripped down. There's not much here. The main JavaScript is even smaller. It has an onload function. And if you look back at the index.html, when the body is called, it calls the onload function. So when the page loads, basically, and it does a couple of small things. It sets the title to some app property from App Machine, and it also gets the element called block name. It sets the inner text to some App Machine properties as well. And again, these core components here, these modules, are what allows you to use these specific calls from App Machine. Now, again, this isn't very useful. There's not a whole lot here, but it's just enough to get you started. But this isn't what I want, so I'm going to get rid of this, actually. I'm going to delete this. And I'm going to show you my JavaScript block. Again, it's another JavaScript block that I've put together in advance. Again, the same two files, index.html and main.js. Now, here's what my index.html looks like. So again, the top's the same, some of the App Machine modules. And then I've got a whole bunch, I've got a form in here, I've got a bunch of elements, inputs with names, and so again, this is very generic. I mean, this is pretty standard HTML. So if you're familiar with this, this is very easy to use. I've got some styles in there that I can use, and again, I'm using percentages because I don't know how big the phone's going to be that I'm looking at. So I want to use percentages, not absolute pixels. But and you know, I've got list box, and I've got check boxes, and you know, more list boxes, and I've got multiple divs, some of them hidden, some of them not, depending on the data coming back. Maybe a specific div would be displayed and another one would be hidden. So again, this is really this is where the App Machine JavaScript really shines, because like I said, my app is very data specific. It's data driven. So depending on a certain data, I may show a specific div and hide a specific div, or disable a button and enable a button. So again, this is fairly standard. Looking at the JavaScript, what I've got is I've got a different onload. It's pretty much the same, but my JavaScript function is invoked after a list is invoked. So we go back here, we'll take a look. So you can see this is actually a list. It calls this function and it returns these values. So I can use these in my JavaScript block because it's a child block. So any one of these fields that are returned from this list call I can use. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the JavaScript, and basically when the onload is called, I am going to get the current record that's returned from the list, and I'm going to call a function called load values with that record. And what's going to happen is I'm going to take that record, and I'm going to, again, this is data driven, so I'm going to look at the data. If the account ID is negative, if it's not equal to -1, I do some things here. I'm going to get some elements and set their displays. I'm going to set their values, so I can reference these. So I'm going to set this thing called m_uid to some of these app properties. I'm going to get an element called first name, and I'm going to set it to record, which was passed in fname. That was one of the fields. The last name, which is an HTML element, I'm going to set that to record.lname. I'm going to do the same thing with email address, passwords, and all those things. I'm going to take a look and see if some of these things are true. Then I'm going to set some certain fields certain ways, and maybe enable and disable things. So this is how you would use some of the components to actually load data. So I'm going to populate the fields with the record that I retrieved from my web service call. And this is how you would do it. So again, I'm using the word record because that's what was passed in. And any field, I just specify the field name, and I can set it to any element that I want. That's that. I also have a validate function. So go back to my HTML. If someone clicks a button, let's see, where's the button here? So if they click a button, they're going to call this validate function. Again, this is standard JavaScript and standard HTML. They call this JavaScript function validate. Well, here's the validate function. So just like a web page, I can make sure the first name and the last name, that they're all supplied, and if not, show an alert and then set the focus. All of these things can be done. Very simple. If I'm going to submit a form, so I do have a form in here. In that form, I've got all these fields. Now I want to submit that to a function called, or to a service, or just some function on my back end. Let's say I'm going to allow them to update their account, maybe change their password or whatnot. Change any field for that matter. I'm going to call this function called submit form. So after I validate, I'm going to submit the form, and what I'm going to use is the XML HTTP request. And this is a way to fire off a function in the back end. I can either do it asynchronously or synchronously, and then get a response. So again, it's going to submit all of the fields that I've got in that form to my back end for processing. And then, depending on the response, I will either send them back. Here's an app machine API call, window app go back. I'm going to go back a screen, which would send them up to this my account. Or maybe I'll show them an alert if there was a problem. Maybe they didn't supply their password. Or maybe their password was supplied, but it wasn't secure enough. It didn't have a digit in it, and the back end checks for that. And so I might supply a message to the user to fix it. And I can see here's the URL. Again, if you haven't seen the XML HTTP request, you should look that up. But this is, again, nothing, there's no magic here. This isn't app machine specific. This is JavaScript. And here's how you make a call, and here's the URL, and I'm asking it to send in this form data, and then I issue a post, and it sends the request. And then when it's done, it'll come into this section with the response, and then I can parse out the response. Since I've written the code, I know what the responses are going to be, and I can trap the responses appropriately. One thing I wanted to mention is that when you are calling XML HTTP requests, here's some snippet of code behind the scenes that's getting called. In order for you to be able to execute that piece of code, whether it be a GET or a POST call, you have to set these two header components over here. They look like this. This allows this function to be called from anywhere. Typically, when you're calling these XML HTTP requests, they're being invoked from the web server. And so there isn't a lot, the security is pretty good because it will check to make sure that it's actually on the host that you're invoking it from. And so there's really not a lot of security that's involved. However, as this is being invoked from a mobile application, it isn't on the web server. And so I have to allow remote access to these function calls in order to be able to call them. So when I call my XML HTTP request, if I don't have these two header components, in this case my PHP code, the call will fail and you'll get security exceptions because the code isn't being invoked on the web server itself. So just be sure to do that. That's a trick I learned. It took me a few hours of investigating to figure out why the code wasn't being invoked. Whether it's post or get, you have to put these things in here, and then you can put you can even put a star here if you want. But typically, I'm just going to allow access to the particular method that I'm invoking, whether it be a post or get. I don't want to open it up to everybody for everything, so I'll just limit it this way. Anyway, it's a piece of information. Take that with you, and hopefully that'll help you if you get stuck. Here's another function. Again, you can have any of these functions. You can have as many of them as you want, and depending on what you want. Here's another API call in the back end calling the XML HTTP request. And again, I'm formatting this, so again, I can put whatever I want in here that's JavaScript, and I can make my application that is data-driven work the way I want versus just invoking a web service and then coming back. Again, depending on what happens, I may or may not want to do something and take action, and so the JavaScript components are very useful. Now, App Machine allows you to take these JavaScript things and download it to your PC and basically compile it and run it on your laptop or your desktop or whatever it is you're running this thing on. I haven't used that a whole lot. I'm very familiar with JavaScript, so I've been able to piece this together without doing that. But they do allow some functionality to actually run it on your your workstation before you upload it back to App Machine. But you literally can go in here and just edit this by hand and put whatever you want in here and save it, and then rerun your app. So to show you what it looks like, here's what mine looks like. So here's my account. This is the HTML that's in this index.html. Notice how I get a little bit better look and feel because I can use styles. So I've got kind of a rounded corner text box. Let's see what else we got here. We got drop-down list boxes, but they're all rounded. And again, the key thing here, I even have data types that may not be allowed by App Machine. For example, checkboxes. The App Machine API doesn't have checkboxes. They have switches and other things, but they don't have checkboxes. But I may want to use some of these. So these are great. I can use whatever I want, anything that's accepted in HTML. And then I've got my fancy button here, and again, when I click it, it'll call my JavaScript stuff, and it does all that stuff for me. So again, very simple, easy to use if you know JavaScript. And then there is some documentation you can find on maybe some things you want to do, like scrolling through records and setting some certain values and stuff like that. So you can go through that, but for the most part, like I said, it's standard JavaScript and very, very easy to use. And so that's about it. That's really all I need to talk about with this because, again, I think it's very simple and very powerful if you already know JavaScript. It's not meant to teach you JavaScript. It's meant to allow you to use it if you know it. And again, if you have data-driven components, this is the way to go. It's very effective, and you can make your app look really good with it. Like I said, with the styling components. So that's it. So I hope this was informative, and good luck using the JavaScript with App Machine.